ideas to an ultimate mystical apprehension of the ideas of beauty, truth, and ultimately goodness. This leads us to Plato's ethics. By concentrating on the particular world, all we can perceive is apparent good. Only with the help of reason can we gain an insight into the greater universal idea of good. Here, Plato advocates a morality of spiritual enlightenment rather than any particular rules of conduct. His theory of ideas has also been criticized for its lack of practicality. Taking Plato at his word, it has been suggested that all he describes is simply an idea of the world rather than the world itself. Others claim that Plato's world of ideas exists only in the mind, and has little to do with the world from which these ideas are derived. On the other hand, the essentially transcendental nature of Plato's philosophy meant that much of its thinking was later to become acceptable to Christianity. Plato's theory of creation, for instance, fits easily into the Judeo-Christian version. According to Plato, the Father and Creator made a moving, living creature in image of the eternal gods. When he saw this creature, he was filled with joy, and decided to make it even more like its original. Since this original was eternal, he endeavored to make the universe eternal as far as this could be done. So he made a moving image of eternity. When he laid out the heavens, he made this image eternal, but moving, in accord with numbers, distinct from eternity, which is one and at rest. This moving image is what we call time. This reads in part like an abstract echo of the book of Genesis, which was written some 800 years before the Pythagorean conception from which it is derived. Yet the explanation of time that Plato gives here, a moving image of eternity, is more than a profound religious explanation, and more than a profoundly beautiful explanation. It is profound philosophy. His explanation of time plausibly joins the numerical world of particulars that we live in to the timeless unity of the world of ideas. Time has always been one of the trickiest notions for philosophers to deal with. It is also one of the least rewarding. We all know time, and it goes on inexorably, regardless of what anyone has to say about it. We all think we know what it is, but it is extremely difficult to describe it in terms that aren't tautologous, e.g., time is succession, or vacuous, e.g., time is but the stream I go a-fishing in, Thoreau. Plato's explanation was a superb poetic philosophic image which not only fitted precisely into his theory of ideas, but also appeared to be the linchpin that held it together. It has been called the perfect fitting cog whose movement drives each part of everything as one. But this fine mechanistic image is inexact, as the world of abstract ideas does not move and is not driven by time. Since Plato, few have offered as convincing an explanation of time. It was another 7 centuries before St. Augustine produced a theory of similar caliber. For him, time was merely our subjective way of viewing the universe. This is essentially Plato's theory turned outside in. During the 1500 years since St. Augustine, only Kant's explanation of time is its peer, and this too is subjective, when it would seem obvious that time is no such thing. Essentially, Kant believed that time is part of our perceptual apparatus, like irremovable spectacles, through which we see the world. But it remains Plato's explanation that best matches the latest scientific theories of time. When he laid out the heavens, he made this image eternal but moving in accord with numbers. In other words, time and the universe started at the same instant. This concurs with the Big Bang theory, which states that we can't speak of before the Big Bang, because time didn't exist then. Science and philosophy are essentially different ways of looking at the world. They are categorically separate. As Bernard de Mondeville put it, one deals with what is, the other wonders why. Even so, it's always reassuring when science and philosophy are in agreement. And when the philosophy in question dates from the scientific era where the most powerful form of locomotive energy was galley slaves, one can only marvel. While Plato was in Sicily, he became a close friend of Dion, brother-in-law of Dionysius, the ruler of Syracuse. Dion took his new friend to meet Dionysius, possibly with the hope of procuring for him an appointment as philosopher in residence at the court. But despite Plato's travels through the world, he remained very much an aristocratic Athenian, and was not taken with the provincial ways of the Syracusan court. Dionysius was an army officer and a tyrant, who also had inflated literary pretensions and believed himself to be twice the man of any of his contemporaries. He married 2 women, Doris and Aristomache, on the same day, and on his wedding night had them both in his bed. Things seem to have quieted a bit by the time Plato arrived on the scene. It all sounds rather pleasant from his description, even if he found nothing to please me in the tastes of a society devoted to Italian cuisine, where happiness was held to consist in stuffing oneself twice a day and never sleeping alone at night. This was evidently too much stuffing for the 40-year-old Plato, whose Athenian fastidiousness soon got on Dionysius's nerves. Dionysius had begun life as a clerk in the civil administration, but had been marked out from the start by his exceptional poetic gifts. He had then risen through the ranks of the army, at the same time composing a few verse tragedies of unsurpassed merit, as all his subordinate officers readily agreed. After seizing power, he transformed Syracuse, by a series of brutal conquests, into the most powerful Greek city west of Greece. In order to smooth diplomatic relations, the Athenians made sure that his drama, The Ransom of Hector, was awarded a prize at the Lenaean festival. Dionysius was not the kind of man to let himself be cowed by some philosophic knob who was trying to catch a job at his court. When he and Plato turned to discussing philosophy, the sparks soon began to fly. At one point Plato found himself forced to point out a flaw in Dionysius's thinking. "You speak like a geriatric fool," exclaimed Dionysius in disgust. "And you speak like a tyrant," replied Plato. Whereupon Dionysius decided to live up to the philosopher's observation and had Plato clapped in irons. Plato was placed on a Spartan ship bound for Aegina, where the captain was instructed to sell Plato as a slave. "Don't worry, he's so much of a philosopher he won't even notice," remarked Dionysius. Some sources have maintained that Plato's life was in danger at this point, but the fact that he was sent to Aegina suggests otherwise, and indicates that this island was probably his place of birth, rather than Athens. Sending Plato back to his birthplace as a slave was just the kind of humiliation that would have appealed to Dionysius. He could also have been fairly certain that Plato would be recognized and bought by some influential friend, thus avoiding serious diplomatic repercussions with Athens. Dionysius's scheme played out just as he'd planned. Plato was given a nasty fright. The prospect of having to work for a living was enough to strike a chill in the heart of any true philosopher. And it wasn't long before Plato was spotted in the slave market at Aegina by his well-heeled old friend Aniceris, the Cyrenaic, who bought him for the bargain price of 20 mina. Aniceris was so pleased with his cut-price philosopher that he sent him back to Athens with enough money to set up a school. In 386 BC, Plato bought a plot of land in the grove of Academe. This was a mile or so northwest of Athens, beyond the Eriae Gate in the ancient city walls. It was a region of parkland, dotted with plane trees, in whose shade stood a number of statues and temples. Here, amidst the cool avenues and tinkling streams, Plato opened the academy, gathering around him a group of followers which usually included several women, among them Axiothea, who dressed as a man. This is recognizable as the first university. The grove of Academe, where Plato founded the academy, and from which the school took its name, was called after a former resident named Hecademus, an obscure semi-divine hero of Attic mythology. Hecademus's main accomplishment appears to have been the planting here of 12 olive trees, offshoots from the sacred olive tree of Athena on the Acropolis. Yet as a result of Plato choosing this site, Hecademus is remembered to this day throughout the civilized world, our version of his name adorning everything from secretarial colleges to cinemas, a Scottish football team, and annual awards for similar semi-divine figures of obscure accomplishment. Today the Grove of Academe is a long, straggly stretch of wasteland in northwestern Athens, where the inner suburbs start to grow ragged at the edges. Beneath the trees next to the bus depot lie scattered ancient stones, occasional piles of dumped domestic refuse, and a few benches covered with graffiti. The site of Plato's academy and the house where he lived are almost certainly lost forever. Aren't good. Only with the help of reason can we gain an insight into the greater universal idea of good. Here, Plato advocates a morality of spiritual enlightenment rather than any particular rules of conduct. His theory of ideas to an ultimate mystical apprehension of the ideas of beauty, truth, and ultimately goodness. This leads us to Plato's ethics. By concentrating on the particular world, all we can perceive is a power ideas has also been criticized for its lack of practicality. Taking Plato at his word, it has been suggested that all he describes is simply an idea of the world rather than the world itself. Others claim that Plato's world of ideas exists. Plato's theory of creation, for instance, fits easily into the Judeo-Christian version. According to Plato, the Father and Creator made a moving, living creature in image of the eternal gods. When he saw this creature, he was filled with joy, only in the mind, and has little to do with the world from which these ideas are derived. On the other hand, the essentially transcendental nature of Plato's philosophy meant that much of its thinking was later to become acceptable to Christianity.